Welcome to the Deep Leadership Podcast. Today I'm joined by Bill Berman. Bill is the CEO of Berman Leadership Development, a company that helps leaders develop the core skills they need to create breakthrough results. He's the author of a new book that's just about to come out called Influence and Impact, which provides an easy to follow, common sense approach to building influence in any level of the organization. As John Maxwell reminds us, leadership is influence, nothing more and nothing less. So I'm excited to have Bill on the show to talk about the subject of influence. So Bill, welcome.
Thanks. I'm thrilled to be here, John.
First of all, let's talk about your company, Berman Leadership Development.
Sure.
What do you do and what kind of companies do you normally work with?
So Berman Leadership Development is a bespoke leadership development company that focuses on executive coaching, assessment for development and selection, and team building and onboarding. Those are the four areas that we really focus on. And we've been doing this for 15 years. And to be honest, it started with just me. There wasn't a plan to build a big business. It was really Berman and Associates. And I continued to do this. I worked with consumer products. I worked with pharmaceuticals. I work with financial services. I work with information services and publishing. And over time, it's just really grown organically. And we've got a pretty big cadre of other coaches that work with me. And I consider them my colleagues, not my employees. And I've got a team of really great people working for me who are helping to make all this happen.
Oh, that's great. I mean, 15 years, that's something to be proud of. I mean, in terms of growing and especially organically, like you mentioned.
I love what I do, and I'm going to keep doing it every day.
Oh, that's great. That's awesome. So what would you say makes Berman Leadership Development so unique? What's your specialty? What do your customers say that you offer that other people don't?
That's a really good question. There are a lot of coaches out there. It's a pretty saturated market these days. There are a lot of ways for people to pick this as a second career and to get into it through training, and both online and in-person training. When I made the transition from the software company I was working for to executive coaching, I had a coach, and that coach asked me, "What do you really like doing?" And I said, "I really like helping people do better." He said, "Well, what about executive coaching?" That was in 2004. I didn't know what it was. And he said, "You've got the advantage of you have both a deep psychology background and you have business experience, line management experience." He said, "That's an unusual combination. Most people have one or the other." He said, "I think that'll differentiate you in the market." And it really has. I think it's made a huge difference because I can both empathize with what leaders are going through when they're having to make tough decisions. And at the same time, I can understand them on different levels of both psychology and organizations. And what I've tried to do over that time is when I bring in new coaches and I onboard them, I look for people who have some kind of business experience and some kind of psychological background. So what differentiates us, number one, is that sort of blend of business and psychology understanding. And number two, I really, for the most part, only work with very experienced coaches. I try not to work with early coaches, except in a very much a training and development sort of framework. But if I'm called to coach a C-suite executive or a general manager of a $600 million business, I'm not going to give them somebody who's been doing this for 4 years. I'm going to find somebody who does it for 20 years, who has been in business, who understands those challenges.
No, that makes sense. It's interesting, as I have run this podcast, I've met so many people in the psychology business that are in the leadership space. And, as I talk about a lot, is that leadership is a people business, and who better to understand people than folks like yourself who understand, it's kind of interesting. Like you said, you have a blend of both experience actually running a department, having people work for you, and the psychology background. And I think that's an interesting combination, but it's amazing to me how many people from the psychology world have entered the leadership space.
There's a large group of psychologists that feel like it's enough to know about leadership. And there has been in industrial organizational psychology and in organization development a lot of research done on what good leaders are versus not great leaders.
Mm.
And so we do know a fair amount of what makes for good leadership in different contexts, because there's not one type of leadership that's right for all situations. But fundamentally, the language of business is finance.
Mm.
And if you don't understand the finances of this, at least at a superficial level, and if you don't understand the business at an organizational level, you're gonna struggle with helping people pick the right leadership style for the right situation.
Yeah, that makes sense. Makes a lot of sense.
And you're also gonna have trouble getting senior leaders to trust you, because if they start talking to you about their gross margin and needing to change that, and you look at them with a blank stare, they're not going to value your judgment.
Yeah.
You may be really good at leadership, but you don't really understand the context that they're working in.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to talk about influence here, but if you can't speak the language of the people that you're trying to influence, you're out of luck, right? So you have to speak the language of which a general manager, a CEO, a C-suite executive will be thinking about. What keeps him up at night? What are those subject matters that are important to him? And if you can't speak that, you can't relate and you can't influence. So that's an important part of influence as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the fundamental themes in the book is the notion of, I don't call it this in the book because this is my academic head coming in. It's organizational agility. You have to be able to adapt to the organization that you're in, because organizations have very strong cultures. And the bigger the organization, the older the organization, the stronger the culture. And just like if I move to Japan and I don't adapt to the way that culture operates, I'm going to have a real hard time having influence with the people that are around me. And by the same token, if I move into a company, I'm going to have a hard time having influence if I don't understand how they work on a day-to-day basis and don't in some way adhere to those norms.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've seen it before where you have somebody like you hire from the outside and they come from a very unique and special culture, and then they come into your business, which is a unique and special culture, and something doesn't work there. It doesn't fit because they're used to doing things a certain way and you do things differently in your organization. I had an opportunity where I combined 3 businesses into one building at one time. And what I realized is that my existing business plus the 2 that we brought into the business, they all had 3 unique cultures, and I was blending those 3 cultures together. And there were great things in each culture, and I wanted us to take the best of all to become this, but it was harder than I expected. So it was much harder than I expected, because everybody was sort of, well, that's not the way we did it over here, and so it was hard to blend those cultures together. And so I know exactly what you're talking about.
John, that's probably one of the hardest tasks an executive can have is blending the cultures of different organizations. People have written about that for years. Who Moved My Cheese is probably the best.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
But that's really tough. And that's the job of an CEO, really, or general manager, is to create the culture that people work in.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. You don't want to throw out the good that existed in those other cultures. And that was what was hard, was to try to say, these guys are really good at safety. We had to bring that kind of idea into our organization.
Exactly.
These people are really intimate with their customers. We need to bring that in. And we were really good at being efficient. And, so like, okay, these are great things that we do. How do we get the best of the best? And it was really much more difficult than I thought it would be. So
I'll bet.
So you have a new book that's coming out, and I'm excited to talk about it. You've got a co-author, George Pratt. It's called Influence and Impact: Discover and Excel at What Your Organization Needs from You the Most. So let's just start off with the basics. What is influence in your definition, and why is it so important in leadership?
John, that's a great question. We all have a job to do. We're given a job and we have to do it. And the first thing you have to do is do that job. And to some extent, that's enough when you're early in your career. As long as you're doing what's the right thing to do, what your boss needs you to do, you're okay. But as you move up in an organization, that gets more and more complicated. And there's not
Mm,
just one person, there are a lot of people. And in the way companies are organized these days, a lot of times the people you depend on or the people who depend on you don't necessarily report to you or aren't accountable to you. And so what you need to do is convince them to work with you and to do things for you. Sometimes it's as simple as getting them to respond to an email,
that's true.
uh, because people are inundated with emails these days. And so you're looking for a way to get other people to pay attention to you. I hear the phrase over and over again in senior leaders, I want a seat at the table.
Mm,
Well, and in our opinion, mine and George, you get that seat at the table by doing three things. It's by knowing yourself really well. It's by knowing your job not just what the job is, but what the key priorities are for your boss, for your boss's boss, for your partners, for your colleagues, and for your customers. And making sure that you're focused on the absolutely right thing to do. Most jobs, number one, it's easy to get overwhelmed by all the different things you have to do. And when that happens, you tend to fall into patterns. You tend to do what you used to do. You tend to do what you feel like you're best at,
right.
or you get excited and you start trying to do other people's jobs,
Mm,
or you get arrogant and you start trying to do your boss's job. And every time you're doing something other than your own job, you're taking away from your own influence. And
mm,
it's not like you sit around and say, oh, I'm going to do what I used to do, but it just kind of happens. And it's one of the reasons why people stall or have trouble moving up. A lot of times the boss if I ask a manager, if the guy doesn't change at all, are they going to be okay in this job today? And they'll say, yeah, they'll be fine. They'll keep doing this job, but they're not going to move up.
mm,
So if you want to move up, if you want more authority, you want more impact on the organization, you have to be able to, number one, build that understanding of your job. Second one, we already talked about, which is understanding the culture and adapting to that
mm,
culture. And that's really important. You've got to be able to understand how people operate on a day-to-day basis. And that's things like, how do they communicate? How do they dress?
mm,
How do you get decisions made? Who has authority and control over decisions? Where does money come from? How do you actually get things done? You know this, you've led your own businesses. There are both formal and informal channels for getting work
oh,
done.
yeah. Yeah.
And knowing that culture and understanding that culture makes a big difference. And the third part, of course, is knowing yourself.
Right.
Because people can find themselves in a job where they like the job and don't like the culture, or the culture doesn't fit with their values, or the job doesn't fit with their strengths. And if those things don't match, it doesn't mean you can't succeed, but it's not going to be as enjoyable. It's not going to
Mm,
spark joy, right?
right. Right.
To borrow from Marie Kondo.
Right.
And we all want our jobs to spark joy,
Right.
fundamentally.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's important. One thing you said that really stood out to me is the kind of jobs that some people have where they don't have a lot of direct reports, but they have to influence the organization. I think of like a safety or environmental manager, or a quality manager. I was a quality manager early in my career. I had a small quality department, but we had a very large manufacturing plant, and I had to influence the organization about quality, but I didn't have the people that really affected quality didn't report to me, right? They were the production employees. They reported to the production manager.
Yeah.
So it was truly an art of influence, because I couldn't just directly tell people what to do. I had to work through the various channels. I had to work with supply chain management, with suppliers, with the production teams and the production employees, the testing department. So all these things I found myself it was all about influence. It was all about, because I didn't have any authority. I just could
Right.
use my words, but I think you really touched on it. I had to know the organization, how it ticked, who had the authority, how the right messaging to be able to get people to be interested in what I was trying to say. So yeah, it was those. There are certain roles in organizations that are, I would say, difficult because you don't have, the large team reporting to you. It's all about that influence and how well you are at doing that.
See, if I was your coach, I would ask you, so how do you expand that? How do you make that even more impactful?
Yeah.
What's particularly working for you in that?
Yeah. Yeah.
And how do you pursue that?
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's absolutely the key. And I've seen this happen, by the way, at the most senior levels of organizations. I had one company I worked for where they had multiple lines of business, but the sales organization was centralized. And so they were
Yeah.
matrix managed to each of the lines of business.
Yeah.
And so if they didn't like the general manager of one line of business, they
Oh
just
yeah.
have to focus on selling it.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So your whole business was dependent on the quality of the relationships and the quality of your connection with the people around you.
Absolutely. I mean, as a general manager in a big company, I've always had a shared sales force, and we always talked about, I have to win their mind share. I have to get them interested in selling my products because they can easily sell someone else's products. How do I gain their mind share, gain their interest, to keep them? So yeah, I guess it was a game of influence, and how do I, keep their attention span and get them excited about selling what I do. In fact, even in my company today, I have sales reps, independent sales reps around the country, and they represent, somewhere, 10 to 20 different product lines. Well, how do I get them excited about selling what I have, right? It's
Exactly.
influence, right?
Absolutely.
And how I connect with them, and how they feel excited about being connected with me and doing, what I would like them to do. So yeah,
Yep.
it is a game of influence. I never really thought about it that way, but yeah.
Totally a game of influence. And there's different types of influence. There's that extroverted influence where you're like, hail fellow, well met kind of thing.
Right.
There was the former president of New York Life Insurance was a guy named John Kim. And I remember years ago, I was talking to a colleague, and he was saying to me, what I want is what John Kim does. He'll sit in a meeting with 20 people, and people will be arguing about things and talking to each other. And when there's a lull in the conversation, John will say, well, I hear what you're saying and I hear what you're saying, but if you look at it this way, you're going to see a different solution. And half the people in the room immediately go, damn, I wish I thought of that.
Yeah.
He just, he wasn't the CEO at the time. He wasn't the president. He was a general manager, but he just had that impact. His timing, his insights, his thoughtfulness, his ability to listen, all played into that ability to have that kind of to influence everybody and have an impact on the organization.
And I think probably over time, people looked to him to help connect the dots, and so he ended up getting probably more influence as he built that reputation of being a listener and a connector, and to be able to put together, be able to see a connection between different ideas and different concepts.
That and doing his job, being successful,
And being good at what he does.
Made him president.
Yeah. Wow. It's incredible. So you were talking as we got started. So, as a leader, sometimes we might find ourselves where maybe our ability to sway others goes away, where our words and actions don't carry the weight that it used to. What happens sometimes with leaders? And you touched on a little bit about getting comfortable and sticking to maybe things that were. So what happens when we start, losing that influence? What's typically happening with leaders like that?
So there are lots of different permutations of it, but basically, leaders do one of three things. They do what's comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
They do what gives them power, what they wish they had, so power and authority, or they do what's easy.
Yeah.
And it's one of those three things. So they either go back. So I've heard the phrase referred to somebody as This person never met a detail they didn't like.
Yeah.
Or this person has never left a job. They just keep adding new ones. And so there are all these ways that people, for example, and I refer to it as mowing the lawn. It's really easy. We sometimes will go and mow the lawn because it's a discrete task. We know how to do it. We know how long it takes, and there's a nice result afterwards.
Right.
Right. And whether it's cleaning the house or mowing the lawn or raking the leaves or whatever, it's really fun to do that and see the product. And when you're a senior executive, there's very little that you do where you immediately see the result of what you're doing.
Right. Very true.
Right? So you have a tendency to fall back into those things. And if you do too much of that, you're becoming a micromanager, you're doing other people's jobs, you're not delegating sufficiently, and you're not defining what your priorities are. And one of the questions I consistently ask my clients is, what are the parts of your job that only you can do?
Mm.
And to focus on that, because the other things you should be delegating.
Yeah.
The other side is that sometimes you start to feel your oats. You start to feel good. You think you're doing great, and you want to start running great guns. And that's when you start taking on other people's jobs or taking on your boss's job. And you're going to ruin relationships faster by trying to do somebody else's job for them or trying to tell somebody else how to do their job when they don't want that advice.
Mm.
You're going to lose those relationships faster than you can blink.
Mm.
Nobody wants to hear what you have to say. Nobody wants you telling them how to do your job. People barely want their bosses to tell them how to do their job.
Right.
They don't want their colleagues telling them how to do their job.
Yeah.
So or taking it on. So it's, you really, those are the ways you derail
Okay.
trouble.
So
And it's not always, it's not always black and white. It's not like you've completely lost it.
right.
It's just sort of waned a bit. People aren't paying attention to you. You're not going to the same meetings, that sort of stuff.
Right. You feel it. Right.
Yeah.
You feel something has happened. Something has changed. I'm not
Exactly.
over time. I'm not having the same influence I used to have
Right.
in the organization. Yeah. I think that especially, as an older employee, when I was young and, was a young gun, people were interested in, wow, what's Rennie got to say about this? As I got older, I was sort of a fixture in the company. And that's one of the reasons why I left and went to another company, because I felt I was way too comfortable and everybody saw me as a certain way. And it was getting out of that organization into a fresh organization was to have a different level of influence, to reset, if you will. And so that's kind of what I was going to talk to you about, is like, how do you, when you find yourself into that situation where you're not having the influence you used to have, right? You talk about going back and trying to understand your strengths and then trying to match them to the needs of the organization. And so talk about that process in terms of how do leaders, go back and evaluate themselves and evaluate the needs of the organization or their bosses. What's that process like, and how does that help you in terms of improving your influence in an organization?
So it varies to some degree based on where you are in your career. So if you're early in your career, the first, say, 10 years, and that I'm making that's arbitrary.
Right.
You probably may not know what your strengths are, or you may have some idea about it, but it's really good to go out and test that. And you can ask your colleagues, ask your boss, ask your friends, ask your family, what do you think I'm really good at? Sometimes I'll have people say, answer the STEM, Bill is really good at blank. Or I really like working with Bill because, and you have them answer that question. And so you build up that knowledge. If you've been in business for 15, 20 years, you've gotten a ton of feedback. You've gotten 360s done on you. You've had leadership development programs that you've been in. You've had bosses who have given you feedback. And when I do a coaching engagement with senior leaders, I would say 80% of the time, they're not surprised by the feedback I give them. They may be uncomfortable with it. They may not like it, but they know it. So it's really taking a step back and taking a brutally honest look at who you are and what you do well. And that'll tell you what your strengths are. Human beings as a group tend to focus on what they do wrong.
Mm,
And they, and because we want to fix things and we want to get better at those things. And it makes sense to spend some time on that. But people are successful because of their strengths, not because of making weaknesses get better. They super excel at a couple of things that make them stand out from the rest of the crowd. So you really
mm,
need to know what your strengths are. Sometimes I'll ask people, what's your superpower?
mm, mm.
But you need to know what those are. And most people know what they are. And that's what you need to play to.
You there's a Scott Adams, the guy that does the
Mhm.
Dilbert cartoons. He talks about, in one of his books, he talked about talent stack, and I really think that that's an important part, especially as you're developing your career. Every person has a unique set of experiences that make them they develop different uh, experiences and different skill sets, and each person brings a unique talent stack to their job. And so in my case, we were talking earlier, I was a nuclear submariner who came, with a engineering background, I was actually a nuclear engineer in the Navy, came into the workforce, and I initially was in engineering, I was in quality, and then they needed somebody to run a plant that made parts for nuclear power plants. Well, they're like, well, which talent stack, which leader do we have in the organization with a talent stack that's unique for this particular role? And I was the perfect fit because of my engineering, my quality, the nuclear engineering side of it. So I think part of looking at your strengths, I would imagine, is looking at your unique set of skills and talents that make you you, right? It's your
That's exactly.
experiences that make you especially unique, and not just, well, he's good with people. Well, a lot of people are good with people, but what does that really mean? So what is
Yeah.
it? What is unique about you as a leader? What, in terms of your strength?
And if you were a mechanical engineer, you're clearly very good at math. You can't do mechanical engineering if you're not good at math. And that's to some degree a talent. You're born with that ability.
Right.
I just can't do math the way neither of my kids, both of whom are scientists. I can't do math the way they do math. But you also have to have a lot of experience working with it and honing it. Malcolm
Right.
Gladwell talks about that 10,000
Yes.
hour
Yes.
thing. And that's really true. You have a talent, but you have to develop it. And by the way, we also, there are degrees of talent. So don't assume that I either have the talent or I don't. Carol Dweck talks about a growth mindset, and
Mm,
it's being able to work on something, to practice something, to really drill into it and get really good at it. It's a matter of taking what you're decent at and really actualizing that, making that really substantial. And that's what we mean when we talk about focusing on your strengths.
right. Right.
But you
And
also, by the way, have to focus on your values.
mm,
This is particularly important these days. We're seeing the younger generation seems to care a lot about their values, things like environmental sensitivity and equity and all those things. And you've got to be clear about what your values are and make sure that the company that you work for at least supports those values if they don't share those values. You can't work in an organization where you just feel like they're doing the wrong things or doing the wrong things for the wrong reasons. So that knowing your values is also important in this process.
I like that. I like that a lot. You talk about, in the book, you're going to talk about, when this thing comes out, you say that once you kind of do understand your strengths and you understand the needs of the organization, you may identify new skills that you need to be able to increase your level of influence. So, what are some of those skills that people find themselves needing, and then what's the best way to approach, attacking and learning those new skills and developing those skills?
It varies a lot depending on where you are in the organization. If you're becoming a first-time manager, it's really about how do you talk to people, how do you
Mm,
listen to people, How do you elicit the kind of performance that you want to have? How do you support strong players? How do you help develop weak players? And at some point, you have to learn to decide that somebody's not in the right role,
Mm.
and that's a difficult skill to develop, and a lot of people never develop it because they don't have to. But having gone through a couple of downsizings at the company that I worked with, um, I know what it takes and to let go of people when you have to, and that's another part of that learning. At more senior levels, as we talked about earlier, you have to understand the language of business. You have to understand what collaboration really means. You have to be able to think strategically, and everybody has their own definition of strategy, and that's a black hole I don't want to go down. But it's thinking bigger picture, it's looking down the road, it's seeing around corners. So it's anticipating what's coming for things that you can't see. It's a little bit like playing the difference between playing checkers and chess. Most people, when they play checkers, know what move they're going to make today, right now. When people play chess and they play it well, they're already thinking 2, 3, 4, 5 moves down the road. Even in sports, we think about not just what's this pass going to be, but it's what's the whole sequence of moves that I'm going to use to get me down the field.
That makes sense.
So those are probably some of the key: innovation, change management. Those are some of the key skills that you need as you get more senior. And learning, there are a lot of different ways to do it. You can work with a coach. You can take classes. Most people learn, by the way, by on-the-job training, by being in a position where they have to do something, and they try things. Some of them work. Most of them work. Some of them don't. And you learn through experience. Experience is the best teacher of all. And I'm sure you and I have both had experiences where you learned a really important sense of judgment, usually by making the wrong decision.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Failure is a great teacher. So
Great teacher.
I found in my career, at least. So
Absolutely.
So you also mentioned that, when we dig into our strengths, we look at the needs of the organization. There may be a time where we find out that we are in the wrong organization, or in the wrong role, or it's time to maybe take our skill sets and our strengths somewhere else. So I think, as I understand, the book talks about, like, what if you get to the point where you realize that maybe the reason I don't have the influence I used to have is that the organization has shifted and I really am not doing what I enjoy doing. And so it might be time to, move on to a new role. So you help people through this book in that process. Is that correct?
That's correct. There's a chapter in the book called, I think it's chapter 6, where we call it the pivot point. Mm-hmm. So you've collected some data about yourself, you've collected data about the job, you've collected data about your stakeholders and the culture. And then the question is, how do I fit here? Is this the right place for me? Is this the right job for me? And if fundamentally it is, then you have the path that we just talked about, which is may need to develop new skills, you may need to adapt differently to the culture. You're not going to get all those things exactly right. So it's not a perfect match, but you're going to work on that. But you may find out that it's just not the right fit for you. Either the job isn't the right fit, the boss is not somebody you want to work for, or the organization just doesn't fit with you. And I think in those cases, the most painful people that I've worked with, the most painful engagements that I've had, are when people know they're not in the right job and still try to stay there and try to do that. And they're not listening to themselves and their organization and saying, okay, what do we need to do to fix this?
Yeah. And
they're either trying and it doesn't work, or they're trying and they're unhappy, or they're not trying. So it's at that point, if you feel like you're not in the right job, you may be able to engage with your manager. George talked about employees that he's had where it wasn't a great fit. and he's helped them find better fit, because
Right.
his
Right.
job isn't to punish them. He's not throwing people away. He wants them to be successful, and if they can't be successful in his organization, he's interested in helping them find another organization where they can be successful. Now, I'm not naive. There are definitely bosses who, if you went to them and said, "Gee, I don't think I fit here," they'd be like, "Okay, goodbye."
Yeah. Right.
Right? Um, so you got to use some judgment about whether you talk to your boss about it, but you can start to look around in your organization. You've got a ton of data now that you've collected. What will be a good fit for you?
Right.
So,
Right.
for you, um, imagine that you got to a general management job and either you didn't like having to make the kind of tough decisions you needed to make, or the executive that you worked for was just a horrible micromanager. You might decide, you know what, I'm going back to an engineering type job. I'm going back to a quality job because I know I can do that well, and I know I love it, and it makes me feel good to go to work every day. So you could have done the same. It sounds like you were between a combination of talents, luck, and skill.
Right.
Um,
Right.
you did really well, and that's the ideal. But that doesn't always happen for people.
No, you're right. And I would say this: in my career, I saw the first major company I worked for, I saw the culture shift over time. I was there 15
Um,
years, and it used to be a very entrepreneurial organization where general managers had a lot of authority. They had we had the responsibility and authority to run our businesses as we
yeah,
saw fit. And over time, we became more corporate. All the directives came from above. We weren't allowed to make any decisions. We couldn't hire and fire. We couldn't do raises. We couldn't do bonuses. Everything was taken away from us. All our authority was stripped from us. And I found myself not having the influence I used to have. I could control my own businesses. And what I found over time is I lost my influence by the culture shifting in the company to more of a top-down company. So my decision was to leave. It was my
right.
time to go somewhere else where I could apply that, get that influence back again that I used to have. And so I would just encourage anyone who's listening to it is you may be doing everything right, and then the company culture shifts from underneath you and you lose your influence, not by anything you've done differently or wrong. It's just that the company has shifted. It might be time to go when you find yourself in those positions.
Absolutely. But you can also imagine someone who's in a position where they're mortgaged, they've got kids in
Yeah,
college,
yeah,
and they're in a situation where they think, I can't rock the boat.
yeah, yeah,
And they're scared, and they're
yeah,
scared for a good reason. And that's where people really struggle, I
yeah,
think,
yeah,
is when they feel sort of stuck or feel like there's no way out.
yeah, yeah.
And what I would tell most people is there's ways out more often than you think.
I was going to say there's always a way out. I think you know you've been around a long time. I've been around a while, so there's always opportunities. There's always and it may not be obvious, but you'll end up finding great opportunities, especially if you find yourself where you're not happy and you feel stuck. It's best to start looking and get those ideas, because there is life outside of whatever situation you're in. So,
That's right.
and that's what I found in my time. And eventually I got fed up with corporate life and I started my own company because I was like, because I went to another company and the same thing happened. So I was like, well, maybe it's time for me to do it on my own. And that's sometimes what you have to do.
I
So
know. We were talking about this earlier, and I said, so you gave up having one boss for having 20 bosses. Well, when you're
right.
in your own business, everybody's your boss, right?
Everybody's my boss. Yeah. I went from never looking at my corporate bank account to looking at it every day. So,
Exactly.
so things changed overnight. Well, this is really good. I think that you've touched on a lot of really important parts, and we've only scratched the surface. And so this book, I encourage the listeners to take a look at it. It's coming out on June 22nd. It's called Influence and Impact: Discover and Excel at What Your Organization Needs from You the Most. So, Bill, how can people find out more about the book and more about your company?
So my website has all the information. It's got a page on the books. It's got a page on me. It's got pieces on all our consultants, which is www.bermanleadership.com. It's BERMAN Leadership, all one word. And the book is going to be available on Amazon, on Barnes and Noble. You can even buy it through our site. We sell it in individual books. We sell it in bulk, and we give presentations or consultations to organizations if they buy, a bunch of books. That's really the place to go.
Okay.
Leadership.com.
Okay, we'll put a link to that in the show notes. So, Bill, thank you very much for being on the show and sharing all of your insight. And I'm excited about this book. I think that you're touched on a lot of really important things here. And I don't think that we think about influence enough in our day-to-day work. So I think this discussion is really, hopefully, it'll get people to think a little bit more about how they're influencing in their organizations and how they can get better at influencing and or potentially may have to move someplace else where their influence would be better accepted, if you will. So this book is going to help you determine that, help you figure out your strengths, how to fit them into your company culture, and how to get better at influence.
Thanks very much, John. It's been a real pleasure talking with you today.
Okay. Thank you, Bill. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and share so we can continue to build a world with better bosses. Until next time, this is John Rennie saying take care and lead well.